Hey, I guess it's good evening in London. It's actually afternoon for me here in the US, but it's great to be here virtually. Hopefully, when everything changes, I'll be able to come visit again. But I know this is advertised as the Three Economies, but you'll see that I'm going to talk a lot about the Three Economies. But the general idea is I'm trying to think about what the platform, so platform rethink, what's the next decade for platform decisions. A lot of the really clever stuff, the Three Economies and stuff, was created by my partner, my peer, Jay Bloom. He also works with me at Red Hat. So anyway, it's been a fun collaboration on this idea. I hope you enjoy it. So basically, last October, Andrew Schaefer on the left, Andrew Clay Schaefer, you may know him, Little Idea. He's been instrumental in the whole DevOps movement. He was one of the founders of Puppet Labs. And I've known him forever. We ran the first DevOps days in the US together with Damon Edwards, and we've just been friends. And last October, he approached me about, would you be interested in coming over to Red Hat to try something new? And he said, I already have Kevin Baer, who's the gentleman right next to him, who's the co-author of the Phoenix Project. And I'm the little guy there. On the right of me is Jay Bloom. They've been working together, and these are people that I have incredible respect for. And so we had a conversation about, what could we do if we went to Red Hat? And so we've been here 6 months. I've written the co-author of Devops Handbook, the Phoenix Project, written probably about 10 books over the last maybe 40 years. And Andrew is, again, iconic in this DevOps community, web operations. And like I said, I wrote the Beyond the Phoenix Project, which is an interesting book. And Kevin was co-author of the the Phoenix Project. So one of the things we think about, so I talk about platform, rethink platform, and where we are in the industry. What do we have to deal with when I will say to you that transformation equals next generation platform, right? So unfortunately, we won't be able to have beers or drinks after the debate or argue it. But so where do we start? We start with sort of enterprise or company buzzword bingo. Right, everybody has a name they're attached to, and then there's an ownership or a deep belief about. And anyway, so to start to get to transformation, we're just constantly figuring out who owns what name are we all dancing around, right? And then DevOps in the middle. And then the other problem we have is that the data says that 70% of, depending on who's reporting it, the 70% of digital transformations fail, right? This is from one report. So we've got a problem, right? And so one of the things I thought was really interesting is in 2015, Adrian Krakoff gave a keynote at DockerCon, and I remember being there. I was actually working at Docker at the time. And I've known Adrian for a while. If you don't know, he was one of the original architects of Netflix's migration to the cloud, one of the first really large companies to go all in on cloud. And he created this presentation, and the title was Faster, Cheaper, Safer. And what was interesting about it, it was really a stake in the ground, or what I would say was the first true north of this conversation that we've been now having for 5 years at least, and possibly 10 years. And, although Adrian didn't create the term cloud native, although some people have attributed to, he didn't define microservices. He's been instrumental in the cloud conversation. But this presentation gave clarity to this stuff we've been doing, in my opinion, right? All those things were buzzing around. And to the most part, enterprises could at least start understanding some clarity. And I thought, as you think about this, as I was writing this presentation, this idea of platform rethink, I was thinking about how a lot of our conversations in IT are based on this triangles. Right. So Adrian's triangle was faster, cheaper, safer. And as he's driving the cloud faster in that, all the DevOps things that you can do, CI/CD, cheaper in commodity hardware now being aggregated for you in the forms Amazon and today Google and Microsoft, of course. And then safer Adrian was a big believer early on some of Sidney Decker's stuff, drift into failure. So he was really putting together this conversation for us to have. And then if we think about the DevOps conversation, it's also a triangle conversation in the same kind of construct where faster is really in terms of agile, maybe little a agile, maybe big A agile, lean in terms of cheaper, and that's like waste, reductionism, all the things we do to create performance, the whole lean mantra coming from Toyota. And then in Safer, it's resilience, some of the safety stuff. If you've never followed John Osbar or Richard Cook in that work or read any City Decker's work, that's really become part of the DevOps lexicon. And then we have the classic project management, which originally was called the Iron Triangle. And really the same conversation, which is time, cost, and quality, right? Time in terms of speed, project management, Gantt charts. Cost is how much is going to cost this project if it's delayed, and then quality. And in the classic project management sense, it was this: you had the arbitrage, like you pick two, you can't have all three, right? In DevOps, we've been able to decimate that argument. You can get all three, and that's a big part of DevOps, the research, DORA reports. Not going to really get into that too much here, but in the end, right, this is the transformation soup, if you will, in this triangle format, right? So faster, agile time, or cheaper, lean cost, and safer, resilient quality. Speaking all the languages, depending on, is it the DevOps, is it a cloud native group, or is it of a classic, so service manager or project management team. And then if you go back to the original caricature of DevOps, was this aha to ka-ching, the wall of confusion between Dev and Ops, and breaking that wall down and creating this ability for organizations to collaborate, right? So there was this original, it was in 2009, O'Reilly conference where John Osbar talked about 10 deploys at Flickr with Paul Hammond. I was there. It was a shock and awe to everybody. At that same conference, Andrew Shaver had this presentation where he defined for the first time the wall of confusion in a presentation he called Agile Infrastructure. So we have this notion of, going fast or sort of basically holding the fort down or keeping us safe, right? Resilience. And so when we talk about, and I'll talk a lot more later about the details of this concept of a three economy notion, the thing what we're missing and have been missing in the IT discussion is this differentiation economy, which is about faster or agile or time-based speed, and the scale economy, which is about our resilience, our scale, our reuse. So you really could say this is the DevOps in terms of two defined economies, or a bimodal economy set. But the problem that really, at the end of the day, there's still a gap. And even if we go back to the wall of confusion picture, yes, we break down the wall, but at some level of scale, where differentiation meets scale. Sorry, overloading that scale term. There's a middle ground. And so DevOps has been a great discussion about like the collaboration, tools, people process, culture, but there's still a rub, right? And even SRE is in a more timely discussion about, or a more recent discussion about that. Still, I think there's a constraint, there's a gap, there's a missing piece. And I'm leaving this as a cliffhanger till we talk about the three economy, but you can guess, I would propose, and actually Jabe has proposed, the author of the three economy idea, that there is a middle economy. The other thing that we've been doing as part of this Global Transition Office, Kevin Baird, Andrew Schaefer, and Jabe and myself, we've been trying to rethink how do you think about transformation? If you think about the upper left-hand corner, right, pre-DevOps, the conversation was mostly bounded around agile or differentiation development. And then DevOps introduced a balance, we would call it a balance theory around operations in DevOps. And so what you have is an east-west change versus stability conversation. But the truth of the matter is, in large organizations, there's really three other parts. There's leadership in the middle. And then you actually have a north-south conversation, like a y-axis, conversation between product management and architecture. So enterprise architectures really haven't been part of the discussion in most enterprises. In fact, they're sometimes 25 years behind. And if you think about this as a Chinese medicine, where you have to have balance and balance theory amongst all these things. So this is really interesting. You're going to see us talk a lot more. This came from Andrew. Andrew Schaefer had come out. So we look at this, and then if you look at again, it's tactical versus strategic. So you can see, development and product are basically on the east-west change, but on the north-south, product is strategic versus, and then you can see operations similarly to the architecture. So another thing, for those who know me, I'm a big fan of Deming. Deming heavily influenced Toyota Production Systems. When America in the 80s tried to figure out what Japan was doing, they coined it as lean. One of my favorite books in the lean discussion is a book called Toyota Supply Chain, where they talk about actually really good examples between the Prius and the Volt, and how Toyota just destroyed GM. But they had this idea of what they call the 4 V's of learning, and that's variety, variability, velocity, and visibility. And so these are really interesting. The variability is interesting because it's about an economics of your choices. If you tied it back, I remember that healthcare.gov in the US was like 17 Java logging frameworks. So this idea of how do you balance your suppliers? What's the economical mix? And Deming would say have one supplier, but if you look at some of the written literature about how Google works, right? They try to keep 2 of everything, 2 kernels, 2 this, right? So there's this notion of constraining to get faster. Then there's variability, and that's about variance, variation, and we'll talk a little more of that. And then velocity is pretty straightforward. I think most people listening right now would understand the velocity. And then visibility is interesting too, because when Toyota was talking about visibility, they weren't really talking about dashboards, although there was the and-on cord and on boards, but they were really talking about communication in terms of making sure teams are very visible about what they do, how they do, and how you communicate with them. So what happens here is if we look at Andrew's 5 elements of I call it 5 elements of learning, that Chinese medicine screen I told you, and then the 4 V's, you have this basic paradox. And so I tried to build a little bit of a mashup to describe this, because what I'm saying is to get to the 3 economies, to talk about platform rethink, you have to understand the motivations and conflicts. So if you look on the top there, I have the 5 elements: the developers, product, leadership, operations, and architecture. And then going down on the left, I have your variety, variability. Think of that as variance or variation. And then I have velocity and visibility. And so, this isn't mind-shattering, but if you put it in perspective, you can see that from a variety standpoint, developers and product want to increase. They want more choices. They want to put more things out. They want to try to drive things as fast as can. Hint, leadership is increase everything down on it. But on the operations side, they want to decrease variety, right? They want constraints. They don't want you having 10 ways to do things. If the healthcare.gov people were just like, let's code, and and nobody really stood and built architecture and design, but operations architecture about decreasing. It's the same thing with variability or variation. In general, developers want to create more variation, the more choices, the more optionality, those things. Same thing with product. Again, leadership is always increased. But operations, they want to decrease variation, right? The architecture certainly wants to create design principles. And if we work down to, we see velocity, very same thing as developers and product want to increase. In general, operations and architecture want to decrease. And what's interesting about visibility, if you think about visibility not as dashboards, but maybe as security requirements, GRC, NFRs, those kind of things, that you have actually developers and product want to decrease. They don't want to be burdened with NFRs. In most cases, they don't want security requirements. They don't want risks saying you can't do this or should that. But on the other hand, the operations and architecture and certain leadership, they want more. They want more NFRs. They want you to solve more technical debt problems. They want you to observe risk policies and all those things, right? So again, trying to set the stage for motivations and conflict. So if we look at, these V's in a little more detail, we look at variety, you're basically talking about constraints, consumables, stability, and cost, right? This becomes the variables or the mixture of that you're trying to drive. And so if you think about it in principles, there's Alicia Guerrero, complex systems author and thinker, industry writer and expert. She says that by curtailing the potential variation in component behavior, context-dependent constraints paradoxically also create new freedoms for the overall system. So basically what you're saying is, in the sense of variety, constraints create freedoms that actually create more opportunities. And so keep thinking about platform rethink when we get to it a little later and how that applies. And then there's the concept of the tragedy of the commons, right? This is also another variety conversation, right? That you have to make sure that your consumables are balanced. In tragedy of commons, the example is if you have too many cows and they eat all the grass, then the system collapses, right? So tragedy of commons. And then you have the other thing about consumables, right? When you think about consumables, you have these enabling consumers. And what's interesting between physical and digital is you have this great opportunity in that data and properly factored functions are not actually consumed and actually become more valuable. So again, think about platforms, and in terms of how this, the more you condense or drive data, the more use you get out of it. And then you have Aspie's law, right? And in Aspie's law, if a system is to be stable, the number of states of its control mechanisms must be greater than or equal in the number of states in the system being controlled. And so think about this as the balance between the controllers and the controllees. If you take sports, simplistic sports, you might have football, and I'll give you not American football, but I would call it soccer, but you would think about, let's see, one team is the championship team. They have 5 great plays on offense. The up-and-comer comes into the champion, and they only have 4. You can only defense against 4 of those. Most likely the championship team wins. The next year, they both can match 5 offenses, 5 defenses. Maybe it's a tie, maybe it's a flip, overtime or whatever, extra time, I guess you call it in soccer. And then, but maybe the next year, so you get the point, the next year, the up-and-comer actually has 6 plays. And I know that's a very simplistic, but it is that balancing of control and controllees that, and again, if you see where I'm going to, is these are the things that the platform should be doing. The differentiating economy shouldn't have to worry about this, and the scale economy shouldn't have to worry about this. And then there's, if you've ever read any of Don Reinerstein's work, Cost of Delay, his whole thing is about prioritized decisions, the service job. What you're looking for is the things that actually will cost you a lot of money if you don't deliver them, and the things that actually make you a lot of money. This is a good graphic that I've used on cost of delay. If you think about the work, there's on the right side, we call the noisy tail, right? These are the things that we pretty much know that are not going to help us. We can eliminate them. We should do experimentation or plan, do, check, act. We have the muddy middle, which are the things that we have a really good understanding of. We don't think they're going to really differentiate it. We're going to lose a lot of money. We're not going to make a lot of money. Making sure we don't over-rotate them. But what we need to find is that, the gold area where these are the things that have a, good reason, so that, we think there's high probability. Let's rotate on those really quick and get the things off the list that would cost us a lot of money if we don't deliver on time, or the things that can make us a lot of money. So what we're talking about is it's about not missing these. If you put a graphic of cost delay, per week by, cost, right? And then, so to summarize on variety, right? Constraints create freedoms. That's the Alicia Guerrero. Consumables, this is the Tragedy of Commons from Garrett Hardin, which is consumables we need to be managed to preserve the system. We don't want all the grass being gone for the cows. Stability is Aspie's law, right? Stable systems, controls must be greater than the controlled systems, or at least constantly in balance, and then cost of delay from Don Reiner. So that's sort of how we think about the 4Vs from Toyota, how it may apply to this conversation we're building about Three Economies. And then we get into variability. In the 4Vs, they call it variability. Just think about it as variation, right? So variation as a discussion. And so here we're looking at statistical process control stuff. I'll do that. Tolerance, finding hidden value by using a variation. And then there's this notion of the Red Queen effect, which I'll talk about. So this is an unknown. I love this. I found this a few years back. Most people know me. I'm a Deming freak. I've studied Deming for years. Someday I'm actually going to write a book about Dr. Deming. But there's this great quote of misunderstanding variation is the root cause of all knee-jerk reactions, over-control, micromanagement, and tampering, right? And so a tool that's not used in IT as much as it really should be is something actually heavily promoted by Dr. Deming, but originally from a gentleman called Walter Schuett, who designed something called statistical process control. This is used in nuclear plants and a lot of other industrialized ways. If you've ever taken a class on operations management, you'll learn a lot about control charts. And just quickly, if you look at that graph, it's a way to use statistical processing to weed out variation that can be harmful. And what you have actually is it's based on a 3 sigma above or 3 sigma below what's called a mean, and you have an upper control limit, lower control. I know I'm hitting you with a lot of stuff. There's a lot more information out there. In fact, if you want to use one audible credit, my Beyond the Phoenix project, we go into this pretty heavily. And there's really 2 things when you want to understand the statistical process control, which is there's special cause correlation and common cause. Special cause means it's basically outside the upper or lower control limit. In general, and this is different in how we think about IT. We think of those as anomalies and events, call somebody, everybody wake up in the middle of the night. In statistical process control, they're either one of 2 things. One is they are anomalies, they're black swans, and there's really not a whole lot you can do for those. Or they're easily put into control because you kind of understand why that happened. The real value that most people don't understand when they look at control charts is looking for trends in between the upper control and lower control, and that's called common cause or control variation. And what you really want to see is very random points. When you see non-random points, like in this one, you see, I think it's starting at the 4th dot, there's like 10 in a row going down. That's one of about 7 patterns that are indicating something is changing in the system. Somebody might have, moved to something or changed some variables. Anyway, fascinating stuff. And then there's something called the Taguchi loss function, and I'm probably at the point where I'm losing you all now. But the Taguchi was also a part of the research at Toyota Production Systems. And quite simply, without going into detail, this is using variation to not necessarily tighten the variation at all costs. It's looking for the edge. How far can you get the tolerance to get the best economic value out of it? And a really better way to look at this is what's called the reverse Taguchi, which is where you invert the thing. And now you can look at the edge. Where do you get the most value? And it's not too dissimilar to the cost of delay from Don Reinerstein, whereas you have, so on the right, you're pretty sure the theory is wrong about these things, quickly experiment and get them off the table. The interesting ideas are the things like in the top there in the middle, like, yes, but they're not going to give you that competitive edge. They're not the big value things. So the real value is on the edge of the tolerance level in the things that you think your theory is right. So it's that little intersection there on the left, just below the red line. And then you have the Red Queen effect, right? This is from Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. The notion of the queen is running in the same place. And so the notion is if you're not moving forward, you're losing, because running in the same place without getting anywhere is losing. So in summary of variability, we have statistical process control comes from Deming and Schuett. We have tolerance, and tolerance is not about how tight can we get it. It's actually how far can we expand within the accepted variation. And then we have hidden value, which is that inverse Taguchi, where can we find the real value, which actually is closely related to cost of delay stuff. And then you have the Red Queen. And so in summary, one of the things I like to say is all this, people tell me, oh, try to let me explain this to my manager. Well, you know what? Toyota did pretty well with this stuff for about 56 years, destroying the American car companies. It's math and it's science and stats, right? Like, okay, if your leadership doesn't want to accept those kind of things, then you probably get the wrong leadership. It's been used in nuclear power plants and hundreds of years of engineering, and just all it's proven stuff. And so quickly, let's go through the other two V's. We have velocity. And velocity is pretty straightforward. In the DevOps Handbook, we had the 3 ways that we used to underpin the discussion. In the DevOps Handbook, we had the first way, left to right. It's about flow. The second way was about feedback loops, again, which is about velocity, right? The quicker you can learn, the quicker you can address, the quicker some people would call this the OODA loop. And then third is continuous learning, continuous integration, the third way, right? This is part of the DevOps Handbook. And then ending up with a visibility as the fourth V. If you haven't heard about Wardley maps, I'm not going to spend too much time. This is one actually Jabe and I did with an SRE project, but it really is great for throwing up the visibility of your strategy, and it's dynamic, right? It has this grid value going sort of north-south, and then you have your east-west x-axis of stages of evolution. Very powerful stuff. If you haven't looked into Wardley mapping, it's great. And then I'll quickly, I think Cynefin, if you haven't used or heard about Cynefin, can be another good tool for sense making. And we're talking about visibility, trying to understand the hidden value, the hidden things. This is a Jabe's joke, if you will. The Cynefin is like you don't like go into a client and tell them about Cynefin. First rule of the Cynefin Fight Club is never tell the customer about Cynefin. Sort of wait till you can use it to show accurate predictions. If you don't know Cynefin, I'll go really quick. It's really 5 domains. There's the 4, and then the middle piece is called disorder. So it's really about, on the left-hand side, unordered or change or disruption. On the right-hand side, it's ordered, stability, sustaining. And then, one of the things in the sort of Cynefin Fight Club is, instead of talking about Cynefin and giving the explicit domains, which I will do in a minute, you start thinking about, what solution should we use in the lower right, the upper right, what problems are we trying to solve? The upper right, the upper left, counterclockwise, what questions are we exploring? And then finally lower right or lower left, sorry, what direction should we head? And so, I'll just put this all together, right? What you really have then is, when I talked about the economies and the gap, if we start on the counterclockwise from the lower right, hopefully I'm getting that all right, if you will, excuse that horrible pun, but we call that the simple domain. It's best practice. It's what we call known knowns. It's documented expertise. In the upper right, I guess my picture might be kind of getting in the way here, so we can fix that. Hey, look at me move, I'm dancing. Is what's called the complicated domain, and that's good practice, unknown knowns, typically high expertise. Again, right side mostly ordered. And then you go on counterclockwise. In the left, we have the complex domain. Actually, really in IT and most of what we do, I would say most of our interesting work is in the complex zone. And that's the differentiation. That's the faster, agile time. It's emergent practice. It's usually unknown knowns or limited expertise. I'll give you a good example. That would be something in the complex domain versus the complicated. If you're an organization that has never used cloud, and now all of a sudden you have this mandate to go to cloud, it's an emergent practice. You have a lot of unknowns. Maybe you haven't hired any expert yet, but you're being forced to dive right in. You've got limited expertise, right? And you're also sort of trying to, I wouldn't say this isn't a framework, but understand where you are from it's a complexity sense-making tool. It's not a framework. You don't put it on the walls. You don't make posters about it. But if you think about, you want to move things from disordered, ordered to ordered, create some repeatability. And then so finally, the promised 3 economies that I've talked about. We talked about let's move my picture out of here again. Oh, there we go, the dancing box loop. And let's go back here. And so as I pointed out earlier, we have something called the differentiation economy and the scale economy. And if you think about the work, it's a bimodal construct. I would say it's been a false dichotomy for us in our industry for many years. This notion that it just magically gets solved with quote, I'm a big fan of DevOps, so I'm not making fun of DevOps, but it like this idea that it magically gets solved when we just say DevOps, or it gets magically solved when we say SRE it. And SRE does add value to that gap. So what is the differentiation economy? We've talked about a lot of this. I guess I got to do my dancing move here. It's about velocity. It's about novel. It's niche. It's experimentation. It's incubation, right? All the things you would think is sort of dev. We call that differentiation economy. And then we have the scale economy, which is the right. This is regulate, reduce, resilience, reuse, consolidation. And so one of the things I think is really interesting is when I start thinking about, let's put that right here. Hey, look at this. I'm the CEO of Google now. Isn't that cool? You got to see, I'm going to go out fishing on my fancy boat because I've just been promoted to be making tons of money. Now, but if you think about Google, right? Google understood this. And I'm going to tell you that Google understood the three economy. They didn't call it a three economy, but they understood this like 10 or 15 years ago when they started out thinking about scale and how are they going to be able to do things in a way that you couldn't do. The place they were going, they knew things had to change, right? They obviously all the sort of distributed computing models that they created, that's a different discussion. But they also understood that they had to have a platform. And the platform had to be open, scalable, and it had to create this world for developers to be unburdened. And what was that called originally? It was called the Borg, and then it became Omega. We see it today as Kubernetes. Shout out for Red Hat, it's OpenShift, right? And so as we drive through this, then I guess you lost my picture. That's okay. By now you've had enough of me. One of the things I remember that Mark Burgess, which was really interesting, he wrote the foreword to the first SRE book. If you don't know him, he is really the inventor of the whole infrastructure as code genre. He created CF Engine, Puppet, Chef, Ansible were all really based on those concepts and ideas. I was talking to him. We periodically have these great conversations about complex system thinking. And we were talking about SRE, we were talking about Google, and he made this comment that what Google did was make a non-deterministic infrastructure look deterministic to developers. I always thought that was a really interesting way. So again, if you go back to the original Borg, right, the developers didn't really have to worry, or the concept was there was this something in the middle. It was a platform. You're going to see in a minute, it's that third economy we're going to address. But it was something in the middle that absorbed a lot of the things that the developers didn't need to worry about. Developers didn't need to know what specific virtualization technology they were using, right? They were running containers long before anybody really called it a container. They didn't have to worry about what type of specific storage device, right? That there's a platform. Developers just saw these APIs and these abstractions of, BigQuery or this, and the infrastructure was bounded by this platform. And it wasn't really as we think it as a platform as a service. So here we go. So Jay basically describes this that gap, as something he calls the scope economy. And the scope economy, we'll go into a little deeper, is that idea that it absorbs the things from the differentiation economy. So the things that, like, in the differentiation economy, developers really shouldn't be doing. These are things like we should commonize or create commons or move those. If you think about all that variety or variability, like that, move that from sort of left to right into the scope economy, and then all the things that the scale economy needs, move that from right to left, and the scope economy becomes a whole economy that's about acceleration of adoption. And I would call it like a clutch or a carburetor. Like it takes the air and gas in from the differentiation economy and then produces the right mixture that allows you to create that adoption and scale, makes the engine go. And so, a scope economy is differentiation, and we talk about recommoning or commoning, like data and, the common, like well-formed functions are reusable, and they don't consume any resources. And then you have scale and resilience. And so this leads me to, as we're winding down, what I would call the title Platform Rethink. And so it's always been about platforms for all the, in general, all the original cloud native companies or cloud titans, all the sort of your Googles, your, Airbnb, Facebook, Lyft, Uber, right? All those, and certainly I know the guy who wrote the Siri or was the architect of the Siri cloud, which was the platform, right? So all this early customer, Netflix example, they all knew early on that you had to invest in a platform. And so platforms are like, if you're not paying attention or you didn't get the memo, like that is the next decade. Now the question is, how do you think about a platform? And this is my joke on it. If you've ever read Stephen O'Grady's the New Kingmakers, he said it was developed software. I mean, he's certainly right. But I would say, actually, sitting here in 2020, it's the platforms that are new kingmakers. And what I'll say here is, in summary, is that when I think about platform rethink, or Jabe, myself, Andrew, and Kevin Bear, we think about the last decade of a platform is a platform as a service. It's about, as we think about now Kubernetes and again, Red Hat, OpenShift, like one way to think about it has been like, using it to manage clusters of containers and creating scale. Who does a better job at managing container management and scale within pods and clusters and all, not a trivial amount of work. Or it's the self-service thing. I would argue that Google 10 years ago understood that it wasn't about that. It was about what we would call a platform as an interface. It's about a service experience. And we would say that this is, by definition, the manifestation of a scope economy. And if you think about, on the left, you like really Kubernetes. On the right, you have all the things that are evolving, that as we push stuff from a differentiation, we have service mesh. So what's in the service mesh? We got circuit breaker, we got chaos engineering, we got, routing function, traffic management, we got observability, depending on whose platform. This is my only time I'll do a shout out for Red Hat. We've got a lot of enterprise stuff in OpenShift, not just managing Kubernetes for years, but like a lot of stuff that like fits the whole ecosystem from the operating system up, right? Last time I'll do any shameless plugs. But the point is, that the more that your platform becomes more of as an interface where the differentiated economy sees it as abstractions and API calls, that actually is the clutch and carburetor for your infrastructure. When your infrastructure people are going to be really good at buying the right hardware at the right cost, the consolidation, you put all that together. We would call that platform by design. And, and that's why, hopefully I've given you some idea of how I'm thinking about platforms, how we're thinking about platforms for the next 10 years. How do you put that in context of some of the lean stuff, the 4 VLs of learning, Andrew's 5 elements in a balance theory between all 5 elements. So we're going to be talking more about this. I know that I threw a lot of stuff at you. I think, we should have maybe 5, maybe 10 minutes of online Q&A if you want. I think we're going to end up here at 40 minutes. So that's all I have here. Thank you so much. Willis at redhat.com, Botchgaloop on Twitter. Again, I hope you enjoyed this.
All right, good. So, yeah, thank you from everyone. Unless you want to open your mics and just hear a little round of applause.
Yes,
but there we go.
We did have a question from Andrew Hardy, but I don't know if John's had a break now, so maybe we'll do that at the end.
I'm right here. I'm still, I hadn't quite left yet.
Okay. Yeah, so how applicable is it to software development? Lean came from manufacturing. So lean, yeah. So how applicable is lean to software?
Yeah, I thought it was 2 questions. Yeah, obviously, I think the 4 VLs, right, are directly out of Toyota Supply Chain, the book Toyota Supply Chain, which is directly from Deming and sort of, so that whole concept, if you ever get a chance to read that book, it's fascinating, where they compare the economics of the Volt from GM versus the Prius. It's just, and they show how the really sort of understanding those 4 VLs of learning just it was a decimation. It wasn't even a contest, right? So that's all of that's really sort of built around the lean notion of 4VL. It's just part of the big sort of lean soup. I think if the other question is how is it relative to software development, I think that's the point. I mean, we over aggregate, and rightfully so, in a differentiation economy, right? Like it's always been about the differentiation economy, right? And that's where we get, I mean, for to grow up in ops, right? We know there's value in sort of, excuse the pun, but not pun, but misuse of terms, differentiation in the scale economy. But the truth of the matter is it's about getting novelty. It's minimal viable product. It's like driving that. The question has always been that what I would call false dichotomy that we've always had to deal with. Like, you know, that there is this differentiation economy that we deal with, and there's a scale economy. And even, you know, we sort of pretty it up with DevOps, and I mean that with all respect for anybody that knows me. We pretty it up with an SRE discussion. At the end of the day, there's still a scale issue of a gap. And why I go back to Google is Google understood that. And in fact, SRE, if you think about, and I'll just end this quickly, I don't want to bog all the time on Q&A, but if you think about the phrase called socio-technical, right? Basically, you know, what I believe Google did very correctly was they had to solve that problem. They hit scale way before anybody else did, right? In so many, you know, what they did with distributed computing and all those things, right? They were so far ahead of everybody else on these massive scale problems. So they saw a scale problem of that gap. What did they do? They created a platform that was a platform as an interface. It wasn't just a self-service. It was a true abstraction for developers to be unbounded. And what did they do? They created, and that was the technical part of the socio-technical contract. What else did they do? They created SRE. That was the social part. And here's the thing. You can't have SRE, in my opinion, really, without a platform, right? Because that's the whole point, is how do you arbitrage the, you know, service level objectives and those kind of things. I mean, Google, the only way Google did it is because they started almost, you know, like going back 10, 12 years with the thing called the Borg, right? So, so yeah, I think it's like completely relative to software development in the sense that there are multiple elements that you have to sort of balance, like in that five element conversation. So yes.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Okay. Oh, one more popped up in the Q&A there from someone called Anonymous Attendee. Don't think I've met you. Never mind. Is there any objective criteria to evaluate a company based on their IT capability, DevOps, SRE, etc.?
Yeah, before I came to Red Hat, that's basically what I do, but none of you turkeys out there actually wanted to pay me for it, so I had to actually take a real job. But no, I used to go in and just interview like 400 or 500 people from really large companies. But yeah, I mean, I do think, you know, if you go back and watch any of my sort of presentations, at some point, if you could put up I have a GitHub project called My Presentations, just because I'm lazy, and it's got my last sort of 10 years. And one of the things I've been doing is the 7 deadly diseases. I need to change that to 7 deadly sins for obvious reasons. But but in there, I talk a lot about how my experience over the last 2 or 3 years have been how to really get value out of understanding an organizational structure. It's all there. You don't need me. But in lieu of that, I think lean value stream mapping, right, is an incredible. If you talk to most of the people who've been reasonably successful in the DevOps community at the enterprise level, they'll say they all basically started with lean value stream mapping. So sort of Google DevOps and lean value stream mapping, and you know, sort of understand how you can work that into a system and start understanding. You know, I was talking to Paula Thrash the other day. She's run some of the biggest government agencies, and she said, you know, you don't have to do it everywhere. You do like 5 of them in a big company, and you start seeing, after you've done your 5th one, you see about 80% of all your problems that exist everywhere. So lean value stream mapping is an incredible tool.
There we go. Another vote for value stream mapping. Brilliant. Awesome. Okay, I think we're done. So we'll let you take your break, John. Thank you very, very much.
Sounds good.
Cheers.
Cheers.